Thank you for joining Direct Women's webinar on Leaving the Legalese Behind, Lawyers as Corporate Board Candidates. My name is Kelsey Velma, and I'll be your technical moderator behind the scenes. I am the Program and Marketing Manager here at Direct Women, and I'm excited to be hosting today's session. Before we get started, I'd like to run through a few housekeeping notes. You should all be able to see the screen right now and hear my voice. The phone lines, however, are muted, so although all of you can hear me, we cannot hear you. That said, you can still ask questions and we encourage you to do so. At the top right of your screen is the GoToWebinar panel. Just open the console, find the questions section, type your question and hit submit. Feel free to submit questions at any time. Today's webinar will likely be approximately an hour with 40 minutes of content followed by 15 minutes for Q&A. Our speakers' biographies are available for download in the handouts section of the GoToWebinar console. Lastly, there will be a short survey at the end of the webinar that we hope you will complete. It's only 4 questions and should take no more than 2 to 3 minutes tops. With that, I would like to turn it over to the moderator of today's program, Trevor Norwitz. Trevor?
Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. Thank you for joining today's webinar on the topic of leaving the legalese behind, lawyers as corporate board candidates, and I guess I would say as directors. My name is Trevor Norwitz. I'm a partner at Wachtell Lipton in New York. My practice is M&A and corporate governance, mainly securities matters as well. And I'm also honored to be a member of the board of directors of Direct Women. Direct Women, for more than a decade, has been focused on fulfilling its mission of increasing the representation of women, specifically women lawyers, on corporate boards. The animating insight of the organization was that while people could say that there were women are underrepresented in the ranks of CEOs and CFOs, there's definitely a rich vein of very, very highly qualified, talented, and experienced women in the legal field who are ready, willing, and able to make excellent corporate directors. We're not going to talk very much today. It'll probably come in tangentially about the arguments for more women on corporate boards. At this point, I think that issue is pretty much settled. And frankly, anyone who doesn't get it by now probably is never going to get it. Of course, it's still important to keep making the point, and most of Direct Women's seminars do relate to that topic. But the problem we have is, while everyone wants women on their board, generally people don't really want lawyers on their board. So that is primarily what we're going to be talking about today. I'm delighted to have with us 2 wonderful panelists, Melissa Clinton and Connie Collingsworth, and it's my pleasure to introduce both of them. Melissa is a Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Secretary of the Aerospace Corporation, which is an independent nonprofit organization operating the only federally funded research and development center for space enterprise. She's a 2019 alumna of the Direct Women Board Institute and serves as a director on the boards of 2 public companies, 3D Systems and Progeny Inc. At 3D Systems, Melissa chairs the Compliance Committee, and at Progeny, she's on the Nominating and Governance Committee. So welcome to you, Melissa.
Thank you,
Connie is Chief Operating Officer and Chief Legal Officer of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. A 2009 alumna of the Direct Women Board Institute. Connie is a seasoned corporate board director, having served on the boards of Premera Blue Cross and the Banner Corporation since 2013. At Premera Blue Cross, Connie chairs the Comp Committee and serves on the Investment Committee, and at Banner, she chairs the Governance and Nominating Committee and also serves on the Comp Committee. So welcome to you as well, Connie. Thanks both very much for being here today. So let's kick off our conversation about lawyers as corporate board candidates. Many years ago, all boards had usually at least 1, sometimes more lawyers on them, and typically they were the company's outside counsel. That changed for good reasons. Companies and the law firms themselves decided it didn't make great sense to have outside counsel sitting on the boards. And so lawyers were effectively banished from boardrooms for a very long time, except, of course, for the general counsel of the company, who was there available to answer any legal questions that came up. And in that time, I think it seemed like lawyers as directors developed a bit of a bad rap of being too lawyerly, too risk averse, kind of Dr. No reputation, umming and ahhing, unable to sort of be proactive. So I'd like to start by asking both of you, maybe Melissa will start with you. Do you agree that lawyers face a negative perception as director candidates? Do you think that is deserved? And if so, what can lawyers do on boards to make sure that they don't actually play into that perception? So we'll start, Melissa, with you, and I think the same question, Connie, maybe will come around to you. And I'll just apologize to both of you and to the entire audience. We do have a couple of questions, so if at some point I don't have the luxury of passing in notes, I may just kind of wave or say, why don't we move on or something. I don't mean to rush you. So, Melissa.
Thanks, Trevor. Yes, I think Connie and I are going to agree on this. I do think that reputation is well earned. You know, depending on how you engage with your C-suite, I think the perception is that lawyers are only invited to the table when there's a problem, and then we're excused after we present, you know, the bad news or the bill that, you know, we're thought to be a cost driver and risk adverse. Now that of course is not true for those of you who are general counsels or aiming to be or working with the C-suite. The better lawyer is a business partner. And I think there are several reasons why we're actually best in the boardroom, but our perception, that perception is real. And when I was trying to cross the divide and get a board seat, it was very clear to me that very few people were looking for lawyers. We are persona non grata, and it's for the reason you named. The thought is that we're going to compete with the general counsel. They've already got one. And what I find interesting, though, is they've also got a CFO, but they'll go look for CFOs. They've also got, you know, a CIO, but they'll go look for someone who knows cyber. They've also got a CEO, but they'll go look for other CEOs. So it begs the question, why aren't they looking for lawyers? I think we will help flip the script, and that every board should actually have at least one lawyer because of the way we think, right? We think differently than anyone else. And because of that, I think we have a unique perspective and we immediately add value. I'll make one more point and pass it to Connie. While I don't think lawyers are attractive, what I found to be ironic is I get more questions from my fellow board members about all things legal, much of which I don't have an answer to. It's just hilarious. If it's legal, they immediately say, Melissa, you know the answer to that. And it's interesting how often we're having a board discussion and something legal does arise. So I think we do add value.
I agree, Melissa, with the perception issue, but also think it's not really the answer going forward. And the history is probably something we have to overcome. I would agree that there is this view of lawyers more generally that contributes to that perception, but it's something I've worked hard against my whole career. So the legal team at the Gates Foundation has a motto of guidance, solutions, and integrity. And I'm very proud of the fact that we have a reputation for not starting with no as the answer, but rather finding out what you want to do and figuring out how to get that done and using our knowledge to come up with creative solutions, which is what you can do if you understand the law. And what I think lawyers can do on a board often, and I've done this personally, is translate the law into really not legalese, but the plain English that people want. They want the answers. They don't want the statute. They don't want the cite. They want to know what they can do. And I've had experiences where actually the lawyers have come in and talked about the Section 280G payments on golden parachutes. And I find myself translating for the outside counsel on the board saying what they mean is this is how it works. And I think that's what a lawyer can do. They can take that and apply it in ways that others who aren't familiar, but there's more to it than just understanding the law. It's, as you said, Melissa, the way we've been trained to think in our exposure. So both of us serve on comp committees. I think that we bring huge value in understanding some of those issues or the governance issues, serving on as the chair of the governance and nominating committee. But I try not to really tread on the area where it's a legal question, and the general counsel should own that answer. And I really emphasize that my role as a strategic business advisor, having practiced for a long time with lots of companies, lots of executives, I have the same landscape perspective of sitting in boardrooms, sitting in high-level C-suites and listening just like a CEO does. And I think that's what board members bring, of a diversity of thought, a diversity of perspective. And then the skills matrix, which is how so many boards are selected, is where you have the question of, do we want a lawyer or not? And I think it's really more, do we want someone who understands regulation, compliance, someone who understands the new issues of the day about how to do diversity, equity, inclusion right without crossing over certain lines, somebody who understands the new concepts that are coming up with respect to disclosure on ESG. I think that's where we're on top of these developments in ways that maybe others in the C-suite aren't, and can really tout that value. And I tell you, one of the main things that they teach you as part of attending the Direct Women Institute is rewriting your resume, because too many people default and to listing originally all the cases they won or the deals they did, instead of emphasizing that they're a business advisor, that they're a strategic thinker. And that's really the way you have to present yourself if you're in the goal of getting a board seat. And I think that's what we have to refashion the description. And I love your analogy, Melissa, about all the other types of C-suite people that haven't held back them bringing on the expertise. So it's a good way to look at it.
So excellent. I mean, in addition to the specific knowledge bases and skill sets with regulation, litigation, all the things that you mentioned, Connie, obviously lawyers are also expert in problem solving, in crisis management. There's sort of a whole mindset, ethics, etc. You mentioned compliance. And I especially appreciate from both of you saying the point about not treading on the toes of the general counsel. You're not there to compete with them. They must own, as you said, the legal answers that are the legal questions the board faces. You're there as a business advisor, and being able to draw that distinction, I imagine, is sometimes tricky when you get asked a legal question, as you say, Melissa, you often do. So making it a little bit more personal now. How did each of you, and maybe Connie, you can take this one first, but how did each of you handle this perception in your own board journey, in making the crossover from a lawyer's lawyer at a law firm, or as a general counsel, to getting into the boardroom? How were you able to approach the process differently, knowing that you would be perceived in a certain way because you are a lawyer?
Well, it goes back to the story of how you usually find your board positions in the first place, which is through networking and people who've seen you and can vouch for you. So the public company board I'm on was looking for someone who was both diverse as well as had background in M&A, because it was a smaller bank at that time, around $3.5 billion. And since I've joined the board, they've done 5 acquisitions growing to $14 billion. So the skill set was someone who understood M&A, and it turned out that the chair of the governance nominating committee at that time had been a director of a company that I had represented when I was outside corporate counsel at the law firm. And it was really interesting because I had not encountered him in any setting for over 18 years. But the company on whose board he sat was a client of mine that I had done 5 rounds of financing for and had handled their sale transaction. And he happened to come across my name back in 2003, I think, 13, as you said, when I joined the board, because there was an event in New York after a couple companies went public with no women on the board, and the stock exchange had an event called Moving the Needle, because the answer for those companies going public was, we cannot find any qualified women. So back to your first point. And the stock exchange hosted a speed dating event, basically with qualified women and minorities, and put together a book. And our pictures and our bios were in that book, and they sent them to every chair of every public company in the United States saying, don't tell me there aren't any qualified people. Here's a whole book of them. And he simply was flipping through that book and saw my picture, had observed me as outside counsel, and had a positive impression, reached out and said, we would like to talk with you about joining our board. That's how I came to be on the board, because he had seen me as a strategic advisor and as a positive approach in the way that I practiced law, and did value that skill set. It's been true since then as well. I mean, as one of those acquisitions, it was a merger of equals that brought on private equity, and they had the right to appoint 5 board members. And that's when the chair of the board said, we think you know how to handle these 5 gentlemen. And so would you please become chair of the governance committee as part of helping us deal with that because of your background? So I give credit that they saw those values, but it is, I think, what you have to tout, how you can work with that in a way that's constructive and strategic.
Right, thank you. Melissa, is there anything about your personal journey that you would add to, how you combat the perception that lawyers are problematic rather than helpful?
I think what I will say is my journey mirrors Connie's insofar as a lot of it relates to who you know. Now, Connie is what I'm going to call, a generation ahead because she got in so early in 2013, I believe you said, which is phenomenal. And as you noted, the numbers are not what they are today. Today, there are search firms that will go looking for qualified candidates based on a specific preference that a board has put out into the marketplace, Spencer Stuart and the like. There's several of them. So that does exist, but I still hazard a guess that the vast majority of placements are based on who you know. And in both cases, that's exactly what happened. 3D Systems came about because of a board member on the aerospace corporate board. They were having export compliance violations. They specifically were looking for someone with a compliance background. And similar to Connie's story, he had seen me in the room regularly every quarter briefing a legal update to the audit committee and managing the whole board interface as a corporate secretary. So it was based on what he had seen, and he gave my name to the headhunter, and the rest is history. Similarly, on Progeny, it was because I was on the City of Hope and still am nonprofit board. City of Hope is a medical center, and one of the board members had started Progeny. They went public. They're doing fantastic, and they were looking for diversity. And the point I would make to the audience is people are watching you. So your board journey starts right now. And the number one thing I would plug that you should do is you should have external engagements. First, if you're a corporate secretary, that's fantastic. Just keep doing your job because those people likely have contacts and they're watching you and they're going to use it. And then whether or not you're corporate secretary, my number one recommendation is that you join nonprofit boards with folks from different industries who can watch you engage. You will both learn from them and you will teach them that lawyers add tremendous value because, again, of the way we think.
So that's great, thank you. And so let's turn specifically to that and let's sort of say, what are some of the specific attributes and skill set that lawyers should, I would say, should appreciate that they have, because they have them, they're living with them every day, but sometimes we don't really think of them and appreciate. So what are the skill sets that lawyers often do have that are value additive in a boardroom that should be touted and presented and put forward when making a case to be considered for a board? Who wants to take this one first? I think Connie, maybe.
Sure,
Yeah.
we'll alternate. I think that you really can oftentimes talk about a subject matter. Sometimes boards are looking for someone, as Marissa said, who understands a certain subject area, if it's IP or if it's a sector such as banking. In my case, I didn't know banking at all, so that wasn't what they were looking for. But the M&A experience was what was the match in my case. But I think in addition to your subject matter expertise more generically, as lawyers, we're trained to be analytical. We know how to ask questions. And actually that's a lot of what board members do, is they read, they analyze, they find the chinks in the armor. They let management manage, but their oversight and governance function as a fiduciary is to take the bigger picture look, to bring their outside experience and make sure that you don't have the situation that I call the Kodak moment or the Blockbuster moment, where you're so focused on your day-to-day business that you don't see what's happening. And I can tell you that story happened to me personally from my day job. My very last international trip was going to Africa to visit our regional offices in South Africa and in Ethiopia. And as part of that, the Gates Foundation was making the initial grants last February to the CDC in Africa and the WHO in Africa. And as I got off the plane to go from South Africa to Ethiopia last February, they took my temperature and did contact tracing. And I began to appreciate from that visit about the pandemic and the impact it would have. And I came back to my board meeting at Premera Blue Cross, which is the largest healthcare insurer in the Northwest. And they were presenting their budget. And I said to them, what is going to happen when we have all this COVID hit us? And it just turned out Seattle was the very first case that was diagnosed a year ago because of a clinic up in a nursing home in Everett. And the board member said that was the first they'd ever heard of it. And my job at the foundation has been the incident commander, having to manage the shutdown of our office in China and all of the issues that everyone has had to deal with as a lawyer that have been amazing in our time. But those experiences helped me bring it to their attention, as well as give guidance in comparison of cutting edge issues that needed to be addressed and thought through. And I think lawyers can deal with crisis and new issues like that out of the box because of our training. But I think you can just draw from your personal experience like other board members, but they might be broader. For example, if you're outside counsel like you, Trevor, you represent a lot of clients. And so you've got the knowledge and learning from working with a number of executives. And I think that's partly what makes the lawyers unique, because we've got that broader exposure at times.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is I think you have to figure out what, let's see, board seats are competed. It's extraordinarily competitive if you think about it. Even with thousands of companies and even with them diversifying, you're talking about one or two heads. So you're talking about, you know, a couple thousand people, if you will. You talk, and so you have to figure out what your value proposition is going to be. When I went to Direct Women, one of the ones I decided with some trepidation, because I got pushed back, to trumpet as an area of expertise was compliance. The reason why I chose that personally was because in my career, I had managed 2 consent decrees for a company. I'd managed how the company was going to adhere to consent decrees. So I figured I could tout that as an area of expertise, and it worked with 3D. It doesn't necessarily work with everyone, but 3D needed someone to do compliance. I also interviewed right after 3D for another very, very prominent board role because they were having compliance issues. So it taught me individually 2 things. One, I needed to be willing to take on some risk, because what some of the folks at Direct Women told me, and I appreciated it when we had this discussion, was that they thought it sounded too lawyerly and too narrow. And so I pushed forward. I think that taking that risk has given me good dividends, but a risk it was. So you've got to figure out what your personal value proposition is going to be, because they're not going to just come to you because you're a lawyer. We know that already. We've established that. So you're going to have to figure out what your niche is. For Progeny, interestingly enough, I would say what the niche is, because I'm not a healthcare professional, 2 things. I'm on the nonprofit City of Hope board, so that gives me the healthcare sort of notch. I don't know that I deserve it because I'm just on the board. That's not what I do. But the other thing that I was frank about is my interest in and ability to communicate around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so that was really important to Progeny, and that is something I know well because my company, we've got a very right-minded CEO who is engaged across the company on improving our measures. And so I do think I can speak with some expertise about that subject. So I would say, taking it back to the audience, that what you want to imagine, and as Connie said earlier, reimagine your resume, or reimagine your bio, but then put it back together around what makes you unique, because that's what you're going to end up marketing to a board.
I found it so interesting that you sort of somewhat disavowed expertise, and I kind of think Obviously, people say women do that more than men. Men are like, yeah, I'm on the board of a healthcare company. I know everything there is to know about healthcare, you know, whereas women are, I'm just on the board, I'm not managed. And I think lawyers might be a little bit like that too. I mean, very much, look, I'm an M&A lawyer. I don't know that much about antitrust. You know, defining your role in a more constrictive, conservative way versus being a bit more expansive, because I'm quite sure that actually being on the board of a healthcare company, you know a lot more about, you know, healthcare than you know you may want to boast about. I think you know, you've both mentioned different particular attributes. Melissa, you were talking about compliance specifically. Connie, you were talking about some M&A experience and experience with securities laws and various kinds of, you know, but there are also sort of general skill sets. One of the things that it strikes me that lawyers are particularly well suited to, which is something that's a good value to have on a board, is consensus builders. I mean, when we're negotiating, even though you're negotiating across the table from someone who has very different desires, you have to somehow get to the middle to be able to sign an agreement and reach a consensus. And I think lawyers, and possibly women, I don't know, are also better consensus builders maybe than other types of professionals. Is that something that you think is a value that lawyers may bring to the table?
I think I've used those skills personally. I think it's always important to be a good listener and to understand what people are striving for as part of, I think, women's overgeneralization perhaps, but we're viewed as more empathetic and perhaps more attuned at times to the vibe in the room and the dynamic, which is really a lot of what board is about. It's the culture of the board. The board doesn't meet that often, and you have to really know your place. So if every board member asks 10 questions, you'd never get a board meeting over. So you have to know when you add value and how to support the agenda. And I think lawyers have a benefit from, as you said, M&A or whatever type of specialization. It requires them to figure out how to get through the maze to the end goal. And I think that is part of the training that helps you understand the board dynamic. So I would agree that board members really don't always understand that. And lawyers, if they're paying attention, can really help with that dynamic and help guide people, especially if you're chairing a committee, as we described as part of our role.
Yeah, I don't think lawyers get enough credit for knowing board etiquette as well. So if you're a corporate secretary and general counsel, you know how a board meeting should run. You know what a good question is, and guess what? You know what a bad question is, right? You know what's going to have management chasing their tail when they already have a day job, and they are going to resent you, and it's going to, and more importantly, it's going to add very little value. And I actually use that when I interview because I think it's important. Not everybody learns that skill because guess what? Only us lawyers typically are the corporate secretaries. So we know good governance. And you take that into the room. You know what a healthy conversation is. You know what a healthy debate is. You frankly also know something that I think others don't realize. Sometimes you can tell when management is hiding something, right? Because I always say in one meeting per quarter, a board can't tell what's going on under the tent. They only know what you bring forward. But if you've been in the C-suite on the corporate side, you kind of know what some of the buzzwords are. And probably more importantly, you know how to dig deep in certain areas. And I've found that to be very useful when I'm in the room. And this is when I put my legal hat on. I can engage directly with the general counsel at times, not always, because you really don't want to cause a lot of friction, but we can go one-on-one because we're speaking the same language. And he knows when, or she knows when I'm digging underneath, because I sort of know how the story ends, right? And I think I'm being helpful. At the end of the day, that's a value add we can give that nobody else can. Goes back to my point that we're actually not getting credit. Every board should have a lawyer on it, in my opinion.
I agree. I mean, they're the ultimate C-suite executives, really, because the general counsel is often in every meeting. The CFO, the CIO, and the chief people officer are not actually in every meeting, but the GC is usually in every meeting and has a very good sense of how the whole company runs. In terms of your own value propositions, Melissa, you've sort of already actually spoken to this a little bit. Connie, maybe I'll ask you to sort of think about or express a little bit how you use your legal background to express your value proposition. I guess it was a little bit further back than Melissa's. And then Melissa's, if there's anything you want to add to that, because you kind of mentioned it in answering another question. So your personal value proposition, you know, that use your legal skills, background, etc., to leverage that and you know, secure a position in not just one but multiple boards.
Well, as you can tell, my career has changed over time. So I started out as a corporate securities lawyer doing private equity, VC financing, hedge fund formation, M&A, and outside counsel for small startup companies. The last 20 years, I've been in what I call a family-run startup with just way too much money. When I started at the foundation, there were only 100 people, and I was the very first lawyer that was hired. So
It's not too much money if it's being used for a good purpose.
Thank you. That's our goal. And it has really been my experience that I built a legal team from scratch. 40 now plus people are on the legal team, and then my role continued to grow as part of becoming the COO. So now I really am pitching, frankly, the fact that I'm a COO. I'm not hiding the fact that I'm a lawyer. I think it brings all the skills that were just described by Melissa very well. But I think I've got a different proposition to sell now, which is easier, to be frank, that I'm a COO, that involves operational issues, managing IT, managing cyber issues, managing data, which is so hot. I'm co-chair of the foundation's leadership council. I think an area that a lot of boards are struggling with, trying to figure out all the new ESG disclosure requirements. The board's turning to me saying, Connie, will you own this as a board member and help us with this, especially with the insights I have working for a large nonprofit. I think that the experience of being the incident commander for the COVID crisis and the fact that the foundation has such a broad international mandate with regional offices around the world, that's another area that some boards are looking for, someone that understands international and all of the issues that go along with being a larger entity. So I've changed, I guess the point of what I'm trying to tell you with my example is I've changed my story. I was fortunate early on to get the board seats when I was the general counsel, and it took a lot of intentional work on my part. But my story is changing just as my career is changing, and it's with intentionality because I do plan to go on to more boards. That's my personal objective. And I take those skills that I'm learning in my day job and offer them up. But I tell you, it works both ways. And it's a point I want to emphasize. So for example, one of the very first things that happened after joining the Premera board was they had a cybersecurity attack that was pretty well known. And living through that firsthand as a board member was the best on the ground training you could ever ask for me as I became the manager of our CIO group. And things like SolarWinds happening and all of those, having the right forensics firm lined up, the right law firm, you know, all the things you need in place, I was able to bring to my day job as a result of having served on these boards. Similarly, right after I joined the Premera board, they went through a CEO succession plan. I've recently gone through another CEO succession at the foundation. Getting to see how it works on both sides of the table, I think is just invaluable on both sides. I bring things to them, I learn from that, I bring it back. And so I'm a big fan of people being board members before they retire. I think that's the other thing we should call out. It used to be the model that you did your career, you retired and you went on boards. And I think it's better to start that early and to take advantage of it and grow professionally and contribute back and stay current. Because I've observed that some of that old model actually is really not good today when people aren't in the loop, in the stream of what's happening with the digital revolution and the work from home and the new thinking of millennials. If you're 70 and on the golf course most of your time, you may not be in touch with those issues today. And I think having your pulse on that is what you can bring and part of my story.
it sounds like you're also saying to general counsels, if you're offered the opportunity to branch out a little bit beyond the legal space and you're interested in being more broadly involved, say as a corporate director, take that opportunity. I mean, it obviously is a personal credit to you as well, but I think a general credit to the profession that, at least in my experience, you are seeing more general counsels being entrusted with broader aspects of ESG governance, sometimes CIO, things like that. And it used to be everything was sort of under the CFO reporting, but now a lot of things are being shifted towards GCs as people are appreciating those roles. So I think it sounds like what you're saying is don't be shy as a GC, become more of a generalist, more of a business person, if this is where you want to go to. Melissa, did you want to add anything to that? I said you'd already spoken to that question, so I'm happy to move on otherwise to kind of the sort of advice portion as we get close to the point where we're going to open up for audience questions if you have. But you know, if you have, but otherwise I would kind of move to the question of specific advice. And frankly, a lot of what you've been saying actually has already been advice, but what specific advice would you offer mid-career or late-career women lawyers who are considering board service, either right now or if they're looking towards it at some point in the future? And I'll get it right this time. Connie, I think we had you as first person to kind of take this one, and then Melissa to sort of follow up with any further advices on that one.
So I think the best thing you need to do is tell people that you're interested, because they don't look at you and see a board member. And one of my favorite stories is how I got on the board of Premera. I knew the general counsel because he'd been a former partner of mine at the law firm. I'd done some legal work as outside counsel for the company before I went to the foundation, but I'd been gone for a number of years. And I was intentional in pulling up the list of the names of the companies in the region that I thought would be attractive to me and that had a good reputation. So part of it is doing due diligence, and looked for my network and my contacts. And the general counsel was someone who I'd stayed in touch with, even though he'd left the firm and we hadn't practiced together for 15 years. Again, another similar story. I had lunch with him and I said, I'm interested in boards. If you know of an opportunity, please keep me in mind. And so that it's not appropriate to say, can I get on your board? It's not how it works. But I actually had that in mind when I dropped the hint. And it was not much longer after that he called and said, I've got a great idea. How about Premera? And I don't know that I would have been thought of if I had not told him that I was interested, or that I would have gotten the other board if I hadn't put myself out there and gone to that event in New York. And so I think the answer for advice is you have to tell people that you're interested. And you have to be intentional about using your network and leveraging. As Melissa said, there's last year, I think approximately 350 board seats for public companies that opened. That is not very many seats because people don't give these seats up. They don't roll over. And so there's also plenty of other seats that are private company. And I think those are great positions as well. But I think you have to really put yourself out there. They're not going to just come find you typically. I think you have to be more intentional and proactive in how you approach the process, including things like Direct Women or a whole group of new opportunities that didn't exist before. There's accounting firms that are offering training. There's training at different, universities. I participate as a mentor in both of those in the Seattle area. So I know there's a lot more organizations, women on board, Direct Women. There's a lot of ways you can learn more about it, including
keeping lists and tallies and.
Yeah, but I'd like Melissa's view on that. I the board list. There's a lot of those. I'm not quite sure how again people are really being plucked out of those lists because it goes back so much to relationships. Just similar to the recruiting firms, it's I think only around 15% of board seats are actually found through the recruiting firms.
Oh, interesting. And I also like your direct advice of, let them know that you're interested, but you can't go to someone and say, hey, I know you're, on the nominating committee. I'd really like to be on your board. It's not how it works.
No.
Respect is probably the one way to ensure that it doesn't happen.
It's a very subtle club, to be honest.
Melissa, would you have anything to add in terms of advice for mid-career women who are interested in going this route?
Absolutely. So what I would say is have your head up and out. because it's going to come from external engagements, as I referenced before. But I want to pay tribute to the fact that if you're a working parent, it's tough to do that because you're just trying to keep your day job. All right. But as soon as you can exhale and you've got a little room, one of the first things I suggest that you do is get on a nonprofit board, preferably one that's not legal if you can find it, and start to show them who you are. It will teach you so much about how to engage as a board, and it will also broaden your network. And in my experience, your board role is going to come, sort of as Connie just referenced, it's going to come, feel like it's out of the blue from the place you never thought it was going to come from, but you've got to be up and out. You got to be looking up and out for it to happen. That I know for sure. The other thing is, if you are working, recognize that you're going to need to have a negotiation with your CEO to get the permission to serve on a public board, particularly a publicly traded board. It's not a given. Some CEOs are not in favor of it. Some boards are not in favor of it because they want you focused on them, because they think it will create a conflict, because they're not on a board, and why are you getting on a board? I mean, I think it's hard. I think Connie's exactly right. There are many benefits, and frankly, you should be. I think it should be favored, but it's one of those things that's a misnomer. It's rare, and people expect you. Part of it is age, the age they want you to be roughly when they're really willing to consider you. Boards tend to be a gerontocracy. The closer you are to 70, the more they like you. I don't know. I think that's turning over, and it certainly isn't always the case.
Tech is a little different, isn't it?
Yeah, but
Tech world is a little different.
Yeah, I think if you're working and on a board, there's a lot of cross-fertilization that happens, but you will need to negotiate with your CEO, and you can start that negotiation, probably my last recommendation here, without your CEO knowing. If you don't actually have a board, don't go telling him or her. But what you want to do is start positioning yourself by being good at your job and starting to lay the foundation that isn't another board going to be good because it shows you how to be the corporate secretary, for example, and it actually does, right? And so you want to, and whatever else, you got to get to know your CEO well enough that when you get the placement, you've already laid a foundation to go in and advocate for your ability to do your day job and join a board. And that usually will start as well with the calendar. So that's one of the first things you're going to ask is, when do they meet? And you need to make sure it completely deconflicts with your corporate board meetings, because that's a non-starter.
Right. Now that's very good practical advice that frankly outside lawyers like I don't even necessarily think about, but you're right, that could really be a fatal conflict if it was problematic. So yeah, very good. A last question, because we have a couple of questions lined up from the audience, but let me just ask each of you just quickly for a minute or two, and it's a sensitive question, but would you do anything differently, knowing what you know now, to what you did before? If the answer is no, that's fine too. Melissa, why don't we start with you, and then Connie, and then we'll take one or two audience questions. Did you do anything different?
I probably would have started that sort of head up and out earlier. Not that I don't know how practically I could have, but in the interest of giving advice, I probably would have thought, I was on a big nonprofit board, but it was exclusively lawyers. And while that's great for my engagement with the legal community locally, I don't think it serves this broader purpose we're talking about, especially because there's not a lot of lawyers with a foothold in boards. So I would say just to continue to think about your persona, outside of your day job. And one other, and Connie really brought it home, and Trevor, you mentioned it, if you can hook non-legal stuff onto your job, particularly if you're in the C-suite, it's a good thing. So for example, internal audit reports in and quality reports in, and to Trevor, to the Office of General Counsel, and to Trevor's good point, you get to start taking credit for all sorts of things. And I think Connie referenced this as well, when they report to you. That's sort of how the system operates. And so you want to lean into that when there's an opportunity. They don't always think of the general counsel, but you're smart, you're capable. So if you throw your hat in the ring, I think we'd be surprised how often companies are willing and supportive of us taking on more if you've been a great leader.
Thank you. Connie, anything you would have done differently?
I think that I should point out, I made my decision to look for boards at the time that my two daughters were getting ready to go to college. And so I intentionally waited because I wanted to prioritize their years with me, but I started just a couple years before. Because I knew it would take some time. So don't think you're going to put out unless you're really fortunate, you don't put out the sign and have a whole bunch of opportunities usually fall in your lap. So you really need to do that. I was very fortunate because my prior two CEOs both were very active board members. Sue Desmond-Hellmann was on the board of Facebook and Procter & Gamble. Jeff Rakes is on the board of Costco. So I didn't have to convince them. They saw the value, but you have to know that this is a big time commitment. I spent a good part of my weekend preparing the materials for the governance meeting that's coming up for the public company board. You have to like it. And I would agree with Melissa, you have to understand where things are in your day job. You don't sign up for these commitments and think, oh, I'll do this part, I'll do this for 3 years. When you sign up for a board, you're really expected to stay on that board for a good 8-10 years typically. Right. And you don't know whether they'll have a cyber attack or litigation or compliance issue or a CEO change. So you have to really be clear about the fact that this is something you want to engage in and stay committed to. So I'm not completely answering your question. I would say that with those pieces of advice, but I would say the most important thing that I didn't learn early in my career as a lawyer that I think women also struggle sometimes with is just staying connected to their networks. So, I can't claim I stayed connected to the person who reached out from Banner Bank. That was just pure happenstance. He got that book. But I think if I look back at the boards and the clients and things, that there's more I could do. A great source of private company opportunities is VC funds. So, I know those funders because I worked on the other side of the table, staying more connected with them as they have new companies that are looking now for women like they didn't used to would be a good opportunity. So it's not doing differently. It's still things I could do, and everyone should do is look back a little bit more about their colleagues and their networks and realize, especially as you grow older, your peers are in comparable positions to you. And you don't think of that, but if you look back and find out where that associate was that you grew up with, you'll find out they're a general counsel and they're in a decision-making role, or they are in a board. And just staying somewhat connected today through the tools we have with LinkedIn and other things, I think are some of the best ways you could really let people know you're qualified and interested.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice. And I will say it's not, I don't know if it's more women than men, but I know both men and women who are excellent networkers and men and women who are more like me and kind of keep their head down and do their job and let that side slip a little bit, which is a shame. So let me turn to some of the audience questions. And I think some of them are great questions, but don't have to be like a long discussion. Some of them can actually be quite short discussions. And if I'm screwing up my eyes here, it's because it's quite small. So here's a question from an audience member that I'm gonna ask maybe Melissa you to respond to. If you are a diverse female that is one level below the GC, but have broad experience, board compensation, committee legal advisor, chief ethics and compliance officer, etc., are boards interested to seek deputy general counsels in these roles, or do you really have to have a GC title to be considered for a board?
I'm going to answer through my lens, so I'm certainly not speaking for all boards. It is a terrific question. I would say my suspicion is that they're going to tend to go to the top person because, again, they do that in the other disciplines. If you just read a board roster, you're going to see a lot of chiefs, or they start at the company to begin with. So I think that tends to be a preference. However, as we're discussing, you've got to keep plugging because you might get a GC role somewhere else Your GC might move on. And so all of that networking and foundation that you built is going to be important. As Connie said, you don't want to just turn the light on and think it's going to happen. So I would say your efforts should be similar to what we described. You should still be figuring out what your external network looks like and building it out no matter what your role. But to be quite honest, I do believe there's going to be a bias for a GC. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but I do think that bias is there.
That makes sense. I think if you have other boards, even nonprofit boards, etc., all that stuff will also help in the mix. But I would have said the same thing, but definitely still worth trying. Here's another question. Maybe Connie can take this one. Do you think compliance executives who are lawyers, specifically something like chief privacy officer, are perceived as being valuable board members, and how might a chief privacy officer's value proposition differ?
Well, again, it would take a special company. Melissa gave some good examples, but I think it's similar to the debate that's been happening. Everyone was looking for their IT expert that had knowledge about cyber. I think they've backed away from that, saying we can buy that expertise, and the day-to-day board meeting isn't going to focus so narrowly on that. I'm actually halfway through reading the book called Range, which is all about the benefits of being more of a generalist versus a specialist. So I think you can leverage that, but if that's your only story, it's probably too narrow. And that's just, again, about how you present yourself. So I think data and privacy are going to explode in every company. And so I think you'll be able to pitch that extra expertise, but I don't think that can be your only story, because it is a bit too narrow, as I have worked with boards and understand how they go about the selection process. There's not a box that says we want someone who knows data privacy compliance. That would be something they would probably buy externally if they needed that advice.
Yeah, I would just add one thing onto that. I know you're trying to get the other questions, with the caveat that you should be an opportunist. If a company has just had a major cyber attack, and at that time they're worried about having fines, etc., which we know can result, they might come looking for someone like you. So your job is to be there if you can. You know, if I were you and I had a privacy background and that company, somehow I knew about it, I would market myself that I'm the person that you need right now. And the reason why I'm saying that, quite frankly, is I don't think I would have gotten on the 3D board if they weren't having expert violations. I don't think they thought, they didn't want a compliance committee before that. They needed a compliance committee because they were trying to do the right thing. And so I think I was an opportunist who was available at the right time. Otherwise, I think Connie's perfectly right.
It's like everything else. Timing is everything, and who you know is everything. And you know, you've got to be hanging around the hoop for the timing to actually work for you. I agree that that's excellent advice. Here's another one. Okay. How do you deal with an all-male, white, chauvinistic board that might not provide a good reference? It sounds like a very specific. I guess well, if you're the general counsel of a company that has a board that I guess is, you know, meets those criteria, and you're worried that they might not provide a good reference, what would you do in that situation?
Well, I think I'm inclined to want to answer the question a little differently. I don't know why your board is your reference. I think there's plenty of people who can serve as a reference besides the board. Your manager should be a good reference. They'll always probably talk to them or other people that you serve on other boards with, like nonprofit boards, as Melissa has emphasized. But I mean, at one point on the banner board, there were 16 men and I when I joined the board, and things are changing. But in fact, I think in general now every public company board has at least one woman, but they're still disproportionately male. And how do you deal with that in any setting? We belong at the table, and you just don't. I don't worry about it. I don't have imposter syndrome. I belong there just as they do, and I don't let it bother me. And it's their problem, is how I look at it, and it's worked well for me. And in fact, yeah.
I totally agree with Connie. You're going to need it. whether it's your corporate board or a board you're trying to get into, the transformation is just now happening. And it is still more white chauvinist, if you will, than there are women at this point. I'm the only female on my board, and there's a massive age difference for many of them, not all of them, but for many of them. It doesn't get to me. That's child's play as far as I'm concerned. I've got a seat at the table. I know what I'm contributing. So we don't know your exact facts, so I don't want to minimize it. It could be horrid, but I would say if there's something you can do for yourself, continue to develop that thick skin, continue to go in and add value. I don't consider myself to be super sensitive. There have been a couple of things said in the boardroom. One I can remember around race that I didn't take a liking to. Whenever it's Michelle Obama, but when they go low, I go high. But the way I translate that is me surviving is me winning, right? Me, when I'm marginalized, I've lost for everybody. But when I can have a stiff upper lip and see right through that with the right sort of smile and still bring my value, that is actually winning, and that's opening doors for others. So hopefully that's something you can do in that environment, which sounds pretty tough.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. There's one last question maybe we can do and we'll wrap up, and that is how should we sort of spoken to this a little bit already, but how should you evaluate non-profit board opportunities? Are all non-profit board services opportunities created equal?
Absolutely not. I think you have to, number one, you have to have a passion for what that entity is doing. You have to really understand whether it's a board that's about fundraising or what your role is on that board. Lots of nonprofit boards are about fundraising, but I think it's, again, there's opportunities for networking. There's all kinds of nonprofit boards. Some are community-based, and all of them are important. They're all doing important things. But if your purpose on the board is to get networking, then finding the high profile ones where you're rubbing elbows with those other community executives is where you get more opportunity. So it depends on your purpose of getting on a board. I don't want to discount the importance of serving on boards. Also, you just learn how boards work. But not all nonprofit boards are very functional. You might learn in a negative way about what's not great about their governance, because some of them are weaker with respect to governance. So if you're really trying to use it as a resume builder, it's looking for those that are respected, well run, with other senior executives on them, both for the experience of learning, but also for the networking upside.
Thank you. Those are the questions that we had. I have one personal one. Maybe you can each answer in one word. Do you enjoy serving on the public boards? Do you find it personally satisfying and gratifying?
Yeah, I definitely do. And again, Connie said it best. It's a lot of work, especially a lot of work if you've got a day job, because the last thing my CEO wants to hear, in fact, I don't think I keep my job if he hears it, is something I'm not doing for the company because of these boards. So it becomes an extracurricular activity. I will say with virtual, connection, you're able to do it during the workday, but you have to pay for it somewhere else. So it's quite an undertaking. You are a fiduciary. There are real matters at stake, but I absolutely enjoy it. And I would say what Connie said, you want to make sure you genuinely enjoy it before you go down the rabbit hole, because it is quite a lot to ask of yourself.
I love it. I feel like I've had more impact serving on the board as far as diversity. I've brought in a number of other women on both of the boards that I've served on. I redid the whole composition of the board from 16 men. Now there's 11 with 4 women. I feel like that's one way I'm making a difference. That's why I'm such a big fan of Direct Women. I think having our voice in the boardroom is one of the best ways to have impact, separate from serving on the board, because having our voice and being at that table really can change things from the top down. And so I love corporate work. I love learning about new companies, but like Melissa said, I have to love it because I spend most of my weekend time on it. I don't do it during it doesn't impact my day job. And so I have to love it because it is a big commitment, but I do.
Well, thank you both, Melissa and Connie, so much for being here, for sharing your insights, for your time. I think, you know, you both, frankly, exemplify just exactly why it's so important to get more women into the boardrooms. And I think right now there are a lot of fronts working that. There are, you know, California laws, the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ. Well, there's people, you know, there's a lot of push. I think that fight is in good shape. But the fight for people to recognize the skill sets that lawyers bring to bear and the personal attributes and the integrity that lawyers bring into the boardroom, I think is something that we need to keep fighting, because A, it's true, and B, it's a very rich vein of highly qualified, talented women, you know, who are really willing and able to serve. So thank you all, and to our audience, we're right on the hour. Thank you all so much for joining us and for being with us and for asking such insightful questions, and for joining us, notwithstanding that there's Inauguration Day and all sorts of celebrations and things that we were worried at one point, should we even go on this day? I'm glad we did. And if you would take a few minutes afterwards, audience, if you can, and just provide feedback on the very brief survey that will launch just after the program ends, that'll help us improve future virtual programs. This program, like the prior programs, will be available on the Direct Women website. And so thank you very much to Connie and to Melissa and to Kelsey, who did a fantastic job just making it really easy for us to do this. And we appreciate it. Thank you all, and